that a spray-shaped image in this gallery, partially covered by the drawing of the megaloceros, is possibly a representation of a nearby erupting volcano. The cave has at least two other, similar sets of images elsewhere, which have always been a mystery to scholars, but it now seems possible that all of them may be depicting the Belvedere volcanic field, which is only 35 kilometers from the cave and which had eruptions that took place between 19,000 and 43,000 years ago. That would include the time when the cave was occupied. If the researchers' interpretation is correct, these images would be the earliest known representations of erupting volcanoes. From the Megaloceros Gallery, you can proceed into the so-called end chamber, where there are images of bison, rhinoceroses, mammoths, and large cats. There are so many here that they make up more than a third of all the images in the entire cave. One group consists of 16 lions hunting a herd of bison. As in many cases throughout the whole cave, the artist or artists used features in the rock itself to make it look as if the animals were moving and alive. On one side it is possible to go from the end chamber into the Belvedere Gallery, which has no paintings but rather a small hole from which you can look back at the left wall of the end chamber. The other side leads into the sacristy, which has drawings of a horse, a big bison, a large cat, and a rhinoceros on the walls and lots of animal prints in the soft clay floor. At this point, the cave system comes to an end, at least as it is currently known. PPPP. In late April 2015, a replica of the Chauvet cave was opened up nearby. It cost 55 million euros to build, but it allows the general public to finally see the amazing images painted on the walls and rocks of the original cave. Each of the images is an exact Discovering Our Earliest Ancestors 113 replica of the original, created by using three-dimensional models, digital images, and other techniques, ranging from scientific to artistic. The original limestone walls are now reproduced in concrete. The stalagmites and stalactites have been recreated in resin. Reportedly, the results are stunning. Thus, all three of these caves, Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet, are now essentially closed off to the public, but the replicas that have been built at each of them are either attracting, or have the potential to attract, more visitors than the originals ever handled. For example, even at its height, Altamira Cave had about 150,000 visitors per year, but now the replica is reporting up to 250,000 annual visitors. Perhaps this is incentive to create more such replicas, just as has been done with King Tut's tomb in Egypt, for many popular archaeological tourist destinations face the problem of preservation versus access. Far from Disneyfying the site, creating such identical replicas will allow many more members of the general public to enjoy these ancient wonders and leave the originals relatively untouched and able to be further studied by scientists. Much has already been written about such art, including various hypotheses by scholars about why such Upper Paleolithic paintings were created in the first place, but much more remains to be done. It is clear that humans of 35,000 years ago had enormous manual skills, understood both art and religion, and were more like us than different. It also is clear that prehistoric archaeology is unique in allowing us to glimpse snapshots of hominin history, ranging from the three individuals who left their footprints in the ash at Litoli in Tanzania several million years ago to more recent times when our early relatives were painting on cave walls in France and Spain. At this point, our image of the human family tree has transformed so that it now looks more like a bush than a tree, with multiple hominin species inhabiting the planet at the same time. For example, we know that 50,000 years ago there were humans and Neanderthals living together in Europe, as well as others whom we haven't mentioned here, including Denisovans in Asia, hobbits on Flores Island, and even, if the geneticists have it right, some as yet unidentified species that also added to the gene. 114 Chapter 6. Pool. It was only 25,000 years ago that we emerged as the sole remaining species, with bits of each of these other species embedded in our DNA. This is a fast-moving field of research, with more discoveries made every year, and so it will be interesting to hear what is found next. Some sites make headlines around the world when they are discovered. Some sites attract outlandish theories like flies to honey. And some sites do both. In 2007, excavations began at a site in modern Turkey named Göbekli Tepe that dates back more than 11,000 years ago. By 2010, it was featured on an episode of Ancient Aliens. According to various accounts, a farmer discovered Göbekli Tepe in 1983. He found a carved stone in his field and took it to the local museum. University of Chicago archaeologists had previously conducted an archaeological survey of the site in the 1960s and had already dismissed it as a probable medieval cemetery because of all the broken slabs of stone that they saw, which they identified as possible tombstones. As a result, not much was made of the farmer's discovery, at least initially. In 1993, Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist, saw the carved stone that the farmer had found and re-investigated the site a year or so later. It took more than a decade to get everything lined up, and 7. First farmers in the Fertile Crescent. 116 Chapter 7. Excavations at the site did not begin until 2007. Within a short period of time, it became clear that Göbekli Tepe is one of the oldest pre-pottery Neolithic sites with evidence for religious beliefs that has ever been found, dating to about 9600 BCE. Schmidt led the excavations for 7 years, until his unexpected and untimely death from a heart attack while swimming in July 2014. The Neolithic period, or New Stone Age, started about 12,000 years ago, in about 10,000 BCE in the ancient Near East. During the first part of this period, which lasted for about 4,000 years, pottery as we know it hadn't yet been invented, and so it is called the pre-pottery Neolithic period. We usually talk about the Neolithic Revolution when we are discussing this period, because it sees the beginning of a whole new way of life. Not only do stone tools change, which is why we call this the New Stone Age in the first place, but this is when we see the first domestication of plants and animals, including wheat and barley, sheep and goats. In an arc of sites running from the top of the Persian Gulf up across to where Turkey meets Syria and then down the Mediterranean coast all the way to modern-day Israel, the Fertile Crescent. This revolution, in turn, changed everything. Imagine having enough food to be able to settle down and become sedentary, rather than having to be nomadic. Imagine having enough food all year round so that you weren't afraid to have more children and could let your population grow. Imagine having your cluster of huts grow to be a village, then a town, and then a city, and your society to grow more and more complex, so that eventually you needed laws, accounting, writing. All this and more came about because of the domestication of plants and animals, but some claim that other things did as well, including the origins of violence, social inequality, and other injustices. There are a wide variety of theories about why agriculture and domestication of plants and animals began in this region in the Neolithic period, some of which have been suggested by very well-known scholars such as the Australian archaeologist V. Gordon Childe. The First Farmers in the Fertile Crescent 117. University of Chicago archaeologist Robert Braidwood, the University of Michigan anthropologist Henry Wright, and a Danish agricultural economist named Esther Boserup. Their suggestions involve possible climate change between 10,000 and 9,000 BCE, which may have led to people settling down in oases, finding the right types of plants and animals that could be domesticated, overpopulation and overuse of natural resources, and other events and occurrences that may have made domestication both necessary and possible. Göbekli Tepe has the oldest known examples of monumental architecture in the ancient Near East. So far, archaeologists have uncovered at least 5 stone circles of various sizes. One of them is 65 feet across. They are impressive. Even the beautiful photographs that have appeared in various publications so far do not do complete justice to them. Most of the standing stones have figures or scenes carved on them, including pictures of animals. They have excited the interest of a lot of people, whether professional archaeologists, the general public, or those with far-out theories. The animals include lizards, scorpions, bulls, lions, vultures, and possible dogs or wolves, in addition to other species. Some of them may even be pictographs, that is, images that tell a story 5,000 years before the invention of writing, which is a novel suggestion made during summer 2015. According to Schmidt, there are at least 16 other stone circles still buried, which he detected using remote sensing techniques such as ground-penetrating radar. Each of the circles that have been excavated so far contains a number of standing stones, including 2 large T-shaped stones in the middle, with smaller standing stones around them. The larger stones can be up to 16 or 18 feet tall. It is not at all clear what the inhabitants of Göbekli Tepe were trying to do here, but Schmidt was convinced that it was a holy place, perhaps the earliest with architecture deliberately built by humans. In 2008, Smithsonian Magazine published an article wondering whether it is the world's first known temple, and in 2011, National Geographic published an article that suggested the urge to worship sparked civilization. 118 Chapter 7. In that National Geographic article, the author pointed out that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were able to cut, shape, and transport 16-ton stones hundreds of feet despite having no wheels or beasts of burden. He also pointed out that they were living in a world that did not yet have writing, metal, or pottery. What's important for us is that Göbekli Tepe is located on the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent and seems to be one of the earliest sites from this time period. In fact, it seems to have been inhabited just before the inhabitants learned the art of domestication, because the thousands of animal bones that have now been recovered and studied indicate that the inhabitants were hunting and eating wild game, primarily gazelles and birds. It has long been thought that humans were able to settle down because of the invention of the domestication of plants and animals, as described above, but sites like Göbekli Tepe might indicate the opposite. Because so many people were gathered at a site like this, creating the stone rings, carving the standing stones, and so on, they might have needed to figure out a way to feed them all, if the usual hunting and gathering methods couldn't sustain them. So, Göbekli Tepe is an extremely important site, but the archaeological investigations have really only just begun. We'll see more from this site in the coming years, as the excavations continue under the direction of a new chief archaeologist. But we should also mention what Göbekli Tepe isn't. It's not the Garden of Eden, and Schmidt never claimed that it was, despite some newspaper accounts that said he did. It also probably isn't an ancient site related to Watchers or ancient Nephilim from the Bible, or to a global catastrophe that some think took place after the end of the last ice age, as was claimed in a book published in 2014. It is, plain and simple, one of the most interesting Neolithic sites currently being investigated by archaeologists. It may shed light on the earliest practice of religion, and it will definitely shed light on the period when humans began to settle down and domesticate plants and animals. In that regard, it joins two other sites that are extremely fascinating in both regards, which we shall now take a look at: Çatalhöyük, in modern-day Turkey, and Jericho, located in the West Bank near the Dead Sea. PPPP. First Farmers in the Fertile Crescent 119. Jericho is a site familiar to many because of the story of Joshua and the Israelites, who invaded Canaan at the end of the Exodus from Egypt, according to the biblical account. There's a whole kettle of fish involved with the archaeology of that story, but in fact, interest in confirming the biblical story led to the discovery of Neolithic Jericho. Jericho lies in an oasis in the middle of what is otherwise forlorn desert. The water supply is adequate for plentiful drinking as well as irrigation, allowing people to survive and even flourish here. From 1930 to 1936, a well-known British archaeologist named John Garstang conducted excavations at Jericho. As part of his interpretation of what he found, he identified one of the layers within the mound as the city captured by Joshua and the Israelites. His hypothesis came under fire, however, and it was suggested that he had misdated the pottery and the level and therefore had misinterpreted everything. He eventually invited Kathleen Kenyon, a young archaeologist who had studied with Mortimer Wheeler and had dug at the site of Samaria a bit to the north of Jericho, to re-examine the pottery that he had found. She eventually decided that there was not enough evidence to reach a definitive answer and that she needed to do more excavating at the site, which is a very common decision for archaeologists to make. And so, she went back to Jericho in 1952 and began her own series of excavations. The stratigraphy at the site, documenting 4 levels and periods of occupation, turned out to be more complicated than expected. Her drawings of the sections that she made, after she had excavated through an entire part of the mound, show a tangled mess of walls, floors, destructions, and other archaeological remains. We should mention here that the concept of stratigraphy, which had been adopted from geology, was introduced into Near Eastern archaeology by William Matthew Flinders Petrie and Frederick Jones Bliss when they were excavating at a site called Tel El Hessi, to the west of Jericho. Several decades earlier. They correctly argued that earlier things are usually found lower down than more recent things, especially in the man-made mounds that we call tells and that can be seen throughout the Middle East, including Jericho. They also noted, as Kenyon found to be the case at Jericho, that the stratigraphy of a site can be incredibly complicated. Kenyon found evidence, particularly more pottery, that indicated to her, and to much of the scholarly world, that the destruction layer found. 120 Chapter 7 by Garstang actually dated to 1,000 years before the time of Joshua. The remains of that city were from the early Bronze Age, not the late Bronze Age. Moreover, it looked to her as if the city had already been abandoned by the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE and would have been deserted and empty, if not completely in ruins, by the time that Joshua and Israelites invaded the region. In any case, while Kenyon was digging at Jericho, she also found Neolithic levels that included walls, buildings, and tombs, and it is on these that we will focus here. At that time, about 7,500 BCE, Jericho probably had a population of about 2,000 or 3,000 people at most. This is about 2,000 years after the Göbekli Tepe remains that we just looked at, but is still in the pre-pottery Neolithic period. It was protected by a thick stone wall, giving rise to the notion found in much archaeological literature that Jericho is the first known walled town. In this same level, Kenyon also uncovered the so-called Jericho Tower. The tower is about 26 feet high and 30 feet across at the base. Constructed of unworked medium-sized stones, it is hollow, with an internal staircase leading from top to bottom. It quite possibly served as a storage unit, or ancient grain elevator, to hold their harvested food until needed, but it probably also doubled as a defensive structure to protect the town. Some scholars also have suggested that it could have served a more social function or even an astronomical purpose. The inhabitants of Jericho buried their dead under the floors of their houses during this period. Kenyon found almost 300 burials, but what was especially strange was what the inhabitants of Jericho did with the skulls of their dead during the second half of this period, in the pre-pottery Neolithic B phase, which lasted for another 1,000 years, down to about 6,000 BCE. During this time at Jericho, and at about a dozen other sites elsewhere in the Near East as well, the inhabitants would remove the skull from the rest of the skeleton, presumably after the body had decayed enough to allow the removal of the skull easily, rather than trying to cut it off. They also removed the lower jaw and then plastered the rest of the skull with clay. In essence, they were basically restoring the flesh of the face. They also put seashells, especially cowrie shells, where the eyes had once been, thereby creating a lifelike appearance. And then they first farmers in the Fertile Crescent 121 frequently placed the skulls in a prominent place, such as in the living room of their house. It is generally thought that this reflects some sort of ancestor worship, but we cannot know for certain, since they didn't leave any records telling us why they did it. It is a bit weird, and creepy, at least in my opinion, to think of the head of Uncle Fred, or even a deceased parent, sitting in the corner of the living room, watching everything that is going on. And yet, I have a painting of my late mother in our dining room, which isn't so far removed, is it? Even today we still have a fascination with skulls, though some people go further than others. When the artist Damien Hirst produced his own version of such a skull, I showed the images side by side to my students, a skull from Jericho and the Damien Hirst skull that he created in 2007. We agreed that they were somewhat similar, but the one plastered skull, Jericho. 122 Chapter 7 that Damien Hirst made was probably a bit more costly, because he created it by using 8,600 flawless diamonds and platinum. The materials alone cost 14 million British pounds. It was offered for sale at the bargain price of 50 million British pounds. Most recently, a joint Italian and Palestinian team of archaeologists excavated at Jericho from 1997 to 2000. They found additional interesting information, including evidence for a large lower city dating to the Middle Bronze Age. Their work temporarily came to a halt when tensions in the region made it unsafe to continue, but they returned to the site in 2008 and have been conducting excavations ever since. The last site that we will discuss in this chapter also has produced two plaster skulls of the sort found at Jericho, but it is better known for other things. Dating slightly later than Jericho, and flourishing between 6500 and 5600 BCE, during the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, this is the site of Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. Excavations at the site began in the early 1960s, under the direction of James Mellart, a British archaeologist. he uncovered about 160 houses belonging to an amazing village or small town, which had a population that was anywhere from about 3,000 to 8,000 people at any one time. The single-story houses were all interconnected, with party walls serving 2 houses at a time. All the walls are made of mud brick, but the very strange thing is that none of them has either doors or windows. There are also no streets or alleyways between the houses, since they are all connected. If there are no windows and no doors and no access from streets or alleyways, then how on earth did they get into their houses? The answer, we think, is ladders. Ladders to get up onto the roof of the house, and then ladders to get down into the interior of the house. This has to be the explanation, since it's clear that the people did have access to the interior of their houses. But this is a rather unusual living arrangement. What could possibly have prompted them to build the houses in this way? First farmers in the Fertile Crescent 123. The answer is made clear by the discovery of a wall painting that decorated one of the houses. The painting depicts a scene of a very large animal, possibly with horns, that is being hunted by a group of much smaller humans together with a few horses. The artist seems to have had a little bit of a problem with perspective, because otherwise this animal, which looks a lot like a wild pig or, more likely, a bull, would have been incredibly huge. Even if it wasn't as big in reality as it looks in this picture, it still is an indication that there were probably large wild animals roaming around in the area outside this village. It would not be surprising if the villagers were afraid of these wild animals and tried to protect themselves from them, which would also explain why they had no doors or windows in their houses, so the animals could not get in that way. By using ladders, which the animals could not climb, the inhabitants were able to ensure their survival, at least from unwanted predators at night. No other explanation works as well. Mellart found this painting during his excavations in the 1960s, but unfortunately he left it unprotected from the elements, so it is not in very good shape now. He found a lot of other wall paintings as well, including one with large-scale men shown running, clad only in loincloths. Another has a rather pleasing geometric pattern above and a number of white hands on a red background below. The hands are reminiscent of paintings that children do in kindergarten, when they trace around their own hand on a piece of paper and then color it in. They've done somewhat the same thing here, in white on red. Other paintings seem to show other hunting scenes, including one in which lots of little men are surrounding a rather large deer or antelope or some other similar animal with large horns. These hunting scenes, many of which are in the same room within a single house, all have in common that the animals are depicted much larger than the human beings who are apparently hunting them. Again, this may simply be an indication of the importance of the animals that they are hunting, rather than the fact that they were really huge. On the other hand, the inhabitants do seem to have had a bit of a fixation with bulls. In addition to the paintings showing bulls, there are also what we call plastic, or three-dimensional, sculptures found in some of the rooms. These are primarily clay bulls' heads, complete with horns, or often just the horns themselves. 124 Chapter 7. We've got no clue why they were so fascinated by these bulls. As we shall see, the later Minoans, who lived on the island of Crete in the Aegean about 4,000 years later, during the Bronze Age, also had a fixation with bulls. There are some theories that the original settlers of Crete came from ancient Anatolia, but the time span is just too great to try to link the Neolithic bulls of Catalhoyuk with the Bronze Age bulls of Knossos, even if it is tempting. There is another wall painting that seems to depict a landscape. In fact, it seems to be the view that one sees when gazing out from the village in the direction of a large mountain that rises in the distance. This large mountain, called Hasan Dejai, is actually a volcano, which was the source of much, if not all, of the obsidian fashioned into tools that is found at Catalhoyuk. Lots of little squares are depicted in front of the mountain in the wall painting. This may be the artist trying to depict his or her own village in the foreground, in other words, Catalhoyuk itself. It also may be the case that the volcano is supposed to be erupting in the picture, at least, that is what one team of scholars has recently suggested. There is yet another scene in which large winged birds that look like vultures seem to be attacking a human figure who is lying prone. This has led some scholars to hypothesize that dead bodies may have occasionally been left out in the open rather deliberately, so that the flesh would be consumed by scavengers before the skeletal remains were buried. In fact, Mellart, and now his successor at the site, Ian Hodder of Stanford University, found a number of burials underneath the floor of the houses, just like those Kathleen Kenyon found at Jericho. It is difficult to tell whether they were defleshed before burial here, though the articulated skeletons in at least some of the burials indicate that they were still fully intact when placed in the grave. Hodder brought all sorts of new ideas with him when he began the renewed excavations at the site in 1993, including basic ones like putting a huge roof over the excavation area, to protect what they were finding rather than leaving everything exposed to the elements as Mellart had done. He also implemented new creative approaches to raising funds for the excavations, including affiliation with a large local bank, much like the naming of a football or baseball stadium in the United First Farmers in the Fertile Crescent 125 states, and support from major corporate sponsors such as IBM, Pepsi, British Airways, and Shell, which is virtually unheard of at other sites. He also was involved in the staging of a fashion show in Istanbul in 1997 and again at the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai, which involved building a large replica of Çatalhöyük, so that models could emerge from the replica before proceeding to strut along a catwalk in their Neolithic-inspired outfits. Hodder had previously been known more for his theoretical archaeological proposals. Before coming to Stanford, he had been a professor at Cambridge University in England. There, he had initiated, along with Michael Shanks and Christopher Tilley, what we call post-processional archaeology, which can be briefly explained as follows. PPPP. Starting in the 1960s, a U.S. archaeologist named Louis Binford developed what's called processual archaeology, frequently just called new archaeology. Up to that point, archaeology and archaeological publications had been primarily descriptive, that is, describing discoveries, sites, and peoples in terms of what time period they came from, where they were found, what culture they should be assigned to, what the objects looked like, and so on. Binford wanted to make archaeology into more of a science, more anthropological, as it were. In this, he was continuing the trend started by other U.S. archaeologists in the late 1950s, who became famous for saying archaeology is anthropology or it is nothing. Binford wanted archaeology to try to explain things, not just to describe them. He wanted archaeologists to come up with universal laws or generalizations of human behavior, as Einstein had done for physics. He also wanted them to use scientific processes and be absolutely neutral and objective in their discussions, which was quite different from what previous archaeologists had been doing. Binford was extremely influential, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, and he and his students spread the message far and wide. It was mostly U.S. scholars who took to it, however. The Europeans were not quite so enthralled, and by the 1980s they launched a movement reacting to it. The counter-movement is known as post-processual archaeology, or post-processualism. Among the leaders was, and still is, Ian Hodder. 126 Chapter 7. Hodder and others rejected, at least to some extent, Binford's reliance on science. The post-processualists said that there simply aren't any universal laws governing human behavior and that it was ridiculous to try to search for them. They also argued that there shouldn't be as much use of explicit scientific methods, because archaeology is not a hard science. Hodder and his followers said that trying to pretend to be objective and neutral in our discussions and interpretations was, basically, absurd. Humans are biased animals and it is impossible to remove that bias from our interpretations. They also said that new archaeology had essentially dehumanized archaeology, and that it wasn't possible to understand the past unless one tried to understand the people and their possible motivations, including the fact that there are multiple voices from the past, such as women and minorities. In addition to the famous dead men like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Hodder is well known for having stated, essentially as a reply to Binford, something like archaeology is archaeology and archaeology is history, but archaeology is not anthropology. Ironically, Hodder is now in the anthropology department at Stanford. Post-processualism is still very much around today, but its stances have led to some problems, including perhaps being a little too receptive to amateurs, since it holds that everything is relative and open to interpretation, even possibly by non-experts. In fact, the involvement of non-experts has led to some interesting activities at Çatalhöyük itself, especially when New Age and Mother Goddess devotees visit the site because of some figurines that have been found there. These particular figurines at Çatalhöyük are of women. They are usually seated and have rather voluptuous proportions. They fit into a category of female figurines that also are found at many sites in Europe but only during this particular time period. Maria Gimbutas, who was a professor at UCLA from 1963 to 1989, saw them as mother goddess figurines, meant to symbolize fertility, motherhood, and the rule of the mother goddess over the earth. It is not clear, however, what these figurines represent at all. Some probably do represent some aspect of fertility or motherhood, but it is not certain whether it is the goddess who is being depicted and for what reason. Would the owner of the figurine have been a woman who? First farmers in the Fertile Crescent 127. Wanted to get pregnant, or one who was giving thanks for having been pregnant? Or was it neither? Some of the figurines show the woman seated on what looks very much like a throne, including one where she appears to have an animal skin tied around her shoulders. This may indicate that it could be a depiction of a queen or a priestess, rather than the goddess herself. Gimbutas's theories are by no means universally accepted, but Catalhoyuk is nevertheless on the itinerary of many mother goddess tours. PPPP. In any event, the Neolithic is an extremely interesting period, even if one judges it just on the basis of the three sites that we have discussed in this chapter. It was clearly an amazing time of transformation, but it is also clear that we are still very much in the process of learning about it. The finds at Göbekli Tepe from the mid-1990s until today, as well as those at Catalhoyuk and at Jericho, indicate that there is much more still to be found. Future discoveries will undoubtedly change our knowledge and understanding of the Neolithic period, including perhaps a more definitive answer about exactly why it was that agriculture and domestication of plants and animals first began in this particular region known as the Fertile Crescent during that time. Pa RT3. Excavating the Bronze Age Aegean. Heinrich Schliemann, the discoverer of Troy, is also frequently referred to as the father of Mycenaean archaeology. The reason is simple: after he excavated at the site of Hisarlik in Turkey from 1870 to 1873 and announced to the world that he had found Troy, he decided to go looking for the other side, namely Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, and the other Mycenaeans who had supposedly fought for 10 years against the Trojans. And so, Schliemann took a break from digging at Hisarlik and tried his hand at excavating Mycenae, the city in the Greek Peloponnese where it was said that Agamemnon, king among kings and leader of the Greek invading force at Troy, had once ruled. It was a lot easier to find Mycenae than it had been to find Troy, because the modern village still had the same name, Mycene in Greek, and the remains of the famous Lion Gate entrance to the ancient citadel were partially visible, sticking up out of the ground. 8. Revealing the first Greeks. 132 Chapter 8. Schliemann thought he knew where to look for Agamemnon at the site. The ancient Greek sources, from Homer down to the later 5th century BCE plays written by Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, said that Agamemnon had been killed after he returned home from 10 years of fighting at Troy. He was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, reportedly at the dinner table during a feast, according to Homer, but perhaps while taking a bath, according to later accounts. The men that were with Agamemnon were killed as well. A much later visitor to the site named Pausanias, who wrote about his travels all over Greece during the Roman period in the 2nd century CE, said that Agamemnon and his men were buried inside the city limits of Mycenae. Pausanias didn't give a specific location for the graves, and so Schliemann had to use his powers of deduction. PPPP. In February 1874, working without a permit as usual, Schliemann did some exploratory work at the site. He dug, as he put it, 34 shafts in different places, in order to sound the ground and to find out the place where I should have to dig for them. In other words, he was digging test pits at the site, a technique that we have discussed earlier, in order to determine where he should concentrate his efforts once the real excavation started. Several of the test pits produced interesting results, but the most important were two that he dug not far inside the Lion Gate. Here, he says, he found an unsculptured slab resembling a tombstone in addition to other finds, including female idols and small figurines. When he returned in early August 1876 with an initial team of 63 workers, he put 2/3 of them to work in an area that was just 40 feet inside the Lion Gate. They were instructed to dig in a huge square area 113 feet long and 113 feet wide. Within 2 weeks, after he had doubled the number of workers to 125, they found a grave circle, with 5 deep shafts marked at their top by fragmentary tombstones depicting warriors and hunting scenes. This is now known as Grave Circle A. The shafts that Schliemann found led to graves with multiple burials, an unbelievable number of swords, and a tremendous quantity of revealing the first Greeks 133. Lion Gate, Mycenae. Gold and silver objects, in addition to other grave goods. Among these were gold masks covering the faces of several of the dead men. According to the story that is now usually told, Schliemann was so certain that he had found whom he was looking for that he immediately sent a telegram to the King of Greece, George I, which read, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." The king immediately rushed to Mycenae, where Schliemann showed him a marvelous gold mask with a kingly face engraved upon it, complete with mustache and beard. That mask now hangs front and center in a display case in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The problem is, that wasn't the mask at which Schliemann was gazing when he sent the telegram, nor was that actually the message that he sent to the king. His telegram to the king was not quite as pithy or punchy, reading, "With great joy I announce to your majesty that I have discovered the tombs which the tradition proclaimed by Pausanias indicates to be the graves of Agamemnon, Cassandra, Eurymedon, and their companions." Moreover, he had been looking at another mask at the time, of a much more cherubic and pleasant-looking fellow. When Schliemann found the more kingly-looking mask before the Greek monarch arrived, however, he showed him the new one instead. 134 Chapter 8. Such a move was fairly typical for Schliemann. Remember that he had begun the excavations without a permit to do so. It was only in later telegrams, such as those to the Minister of Germany and to members of the news media, that Schliemann began saying that he had gazed upon the face, or into the eyes, of Agamemnon. The grave goods that Schliemann found in those tombs included marvelous pieces of work, bronze daggers inlaid with hunting and wildlife scenes in silver and gold on the blades, objects of rock crystal and semi-precious stones, and gold, something like 800 kilograms of gold objects all told. Excavations by the Greek archaeologist Panayotis Stamatakis just a year or so later turned up at least one more grave within Grave Circle A, and now, especially with better techniques of dating available, it is considered extremely unlikely that these are the graves of Agamemnon and his men. Their deaths would have taken place sometime between 1250 and 1175 BCE, if they even ever existed, rather than being the stuff of myth and legend. We now know that the pottery and other objects in the graves date from 1600, 1500 BCE, which means they are from a period 300 or 400 years earlier than the time of the Trojan War. Schliemann probably suspected as much. In his 1880 book on Mycenae, published just a few years after the excavation, he says specifically that the fragmentary tombstones likely dated to the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, and he even gives them a date of 1500 BCE in the table of contents for Chapter 4. And so, he was fairly close to being correct in terms of the date for the tombs and their contents, even if he was completely wrong about whose bodies they contained. In fact, it is now thought that these are most likely the graves of one of the first dynasties to rule at Mycenae, since the city rose to prominence at about 1700 BCE. These rulers would have lived within a century or two of that rise and were buried outside the city wall. At some point near the end of the Late Bronze Age, however, probably about 1250 BCE, the fortifications of the city were rebuilt to enclose a larger area than previously, which is when the Lion Gate was constructed. It was at that time that Grave Circle A came to be inside the walls. PPPP. Revealing the first Greeks 135. Just down the hill is Grave Circle B, which was found in the 1950s and is now adjacent to a parking lot for tourist buses and cars. Since the burials here date to 1650, 1550 BCE, some of them are earlier than those in Grave Circle A. They may have been the very first kings, and perhaps a queen, to have ruled at Mycenae. In 1995, forensic anthropologists working with the skeletal material found in Grave Circle B attempted to reconstruct what some of the individuals would have originally looked like. It could have been an episode of CSI, Ancient Greece. They decided that the remains were from one woman and 6 men. Even though their end results are just a best guess, they succeeded in bringing the long-dead people more to life than the bare bones could ever do. for they reconstructed their faces, hair, and, in several cases, beards as well. Elsewhere on the site are a few very large beehive-shaped tombs, built from huge blocks of stone, known as Tholas Tombs. Several of them have names given to them in relatively modern times, including the tomb of Clytemnestra and the tomb of Agamemnon. These were built about 1250 BCE, so if Agamemnon is buried anywhere, it could have been in these. They were all found completely looted and empty, however. PPPP. Schliemann excavated at Mycenae only in 1874 and 1876. He then went looking for Ithaca, home of Odysseus, after which he returned to Troy for several more seasons of digging. In 1884 he dug at the site of Tiryns, which is only a few kilometers from Mycenae, but never excavated at Mycenae itself ever again. 115 years later, Mycenae and Tiryns were jointly named to the UNESCO World Heritage Site list, in 1999. It was left to later archaeologists to uncover the rest of the site, most of them using much better excavation methods than Schliemann had. The site has been under almost continuous excavation since Schliemann's day, and some very well-known Greek, British, and U.S. archaeologists have spent many seasons there, including George Milonas, Alan Wass, Elizabeth French, and my own professor, Spiros Iakovides. Because of their efforts, what was left of the palace at the very top of the citadel has now been completely excavated. It turns out that it's 136 Chapter 8. Interior, and possibly the exterior as well, was covered with brightly colored plaster, with scenes of hunting and other activities garishly painted in blues, yellows, reds, and other colors on the walls.